Hey guys, and welcome to another very exciting visual effects tutorial. In this video, oh hey Jimmy! In this video, I'm going to show you how to create and work with fluid simulations in Blender. Now this is going to be an intermediate tutorial, and I will assume that you are pretty comfortable using Blender. If you're just getting started, I'm going to drop you links to some of my beginner tutorials down below, so be sure to check those out before you come back here. But now, so that I can go home and just process this, let's jump right into the tutorial. Welcome back to the exciting world of Blender. And since most fluid tutorials for Blender seem to have you drop some liquid into a box, I thought I'd try to make this just a little bit more exciting, so here's a shark. Now I got this cool low poly shark model of Blender Swap from someone called Riser789, so thank you very much for that. The other thing I've set up here is kind of a wind tunnel, like a water tunnel for this shark. And in this tutorial, we're going to create some liquid that we can pour down one side of this water tunnel. It'll then splash over our shark to swim in. So you learn how to create liquids as well as work with collision. Then we're going to look at how to generate a mesh for the liquid so you can actually render that out. And finally, we look at how to generate spray and bubble particles, just to add a little bit more detail and life and realism to the look and feel of your fluids. As always, if you want to follow along, you will be able to download this very file from our website. So simply go to surfacedstudio.com/downloads and you'll be able to grab this file and follow along. Now, the first thing you need to do when you work with fluid simulations in Blender is set up a domain, which is kind of like the aquarium or the space in which the liquid can exist. For that, let's simply add a cube into our scene with Shift and A, come into Mesh. Let's add a cube, press S to scale this up, and let's just make this a fair bit bigger. Now I want to make sure that this cube encompasses the entire water tunnel, including the shark. So G and Z, let's drag this up a little bit, S and X, and scale that out in the X direction to make sure we're wrapping all the way around the water tunnel. And since that hides everything in our scene, let's come into solid shading mode, press Alt or Option and Z to go into X-ray mode. That's a little bit better, but it's not great to work with. Also, if you go back to render shading mode, X-ray doesn't work here, so that's not really all that helpful. But first, let's actually come into the outliner and let's rename this cube to domain, because this is going to be the domain for our fluid simulation. Then come to the properties panel, come to the little atom symbol here for the physics tab. And in here, I want to enable fluid. So let's click on fluid. This is going to add fluid physics to this object in Blender. But there are quite a few different types of objects that we can use for fluid simulations. So let's pop this type dropdown open. And in here, you can choose either domain. So this is the aquarium, the container where fluids can exist and where fluids are going to be calculated in. Flow means either an inflow of fluid or an outflow. It's like a drain where the fluid can drain from, or an effector, which is great for collisions. And we will be using all of these. Now, my domain, I want to set to, no surprise, to domain. You may feel relieved that you can now see the scene again, but in this domain, let's change the domain type from gas over to liquid. And your relief is right gone because the domain is once again solid, because the way Mantaflow, the fluid engine within Blender, works is that the domain itself will turn into the mesh for the liquid. However, until we generate that, until we get to that point, it's just going to be a solid box and it's going to cover up everything in our scene. So the one thing I like to do is I like to come into the object properties. In the properties, come to the bottom, and there's an option here for viewport display. Let's pop that open. And down in here, display as is set to solid right now. Let's just change this one over to wire. So the domain and the liquid mesh in the end will be displayed in wireframe mode. In the viewport, it'll look just fine when we render this out. So that looks pretty good. Let's return to the physics properties, and Mantaflow has a ton of different options for how to generate your mesh, how the fluid simulation is run. We're not going to go through all of these in detail. So for now, I'm going to leave almost all of them on default, but let's come to the bottom right here. So you can see a cache folder here, and that's a folder on your hard drive where cache files are going to be written to, so that in the viewport display, that simulation can actually be previewed. Start and end frame matches the length of my project, so I'm going to leave that on 1 to 225. And the type of the simulation I want to change. So let's pop this open. I'm not a big fan of replay, which is meant to be a more interactive simulation. Doesn't work great in my opinion. So the two options that I recommend is either modular or all. All means when you bake, it will bake everything. The actual fluid simulation as well as the mesh and any particles, everything at once. I much prefer to do this modular so we can essentially rerun physics simulation for the fluid and then rerun independently the mesh generation or rerun the particle generation. So I like to choose is modular. Now I always enable is resumable, but let's leave this off just for a moment. We'll get back to it in just a little bit. So with that, our basic domain has been set up, but now we need to actually create an inflow and point in this domain where fluid gets pumped into the simulation. For that, let's add a sphere. So Shift and A, come into Mesh, let's add a UV sphere. G and Z, let's move this up. G and X, and let's just push this over to the side. And I kind of just want to have it sitting maybe right there. Make sure it is inside your domain. So inside the domain for our fluid simulation. Otherwise, if this sits outside and generates fluids, that never reaches our aquarium and therefore will never get calculated. So do make sure that the sphere sits inside your simulation. Let's move this over a little bit and up just a tad. And let's start pumping in fluids where the sphere exists. First off though, let's come into the outliner. Let's call this one Inflow in here. In the physics properties, let's add the fluid physics to this object as well. Pop open the type. And I'm going to change this over to flow, which is either an inflow or an outflow. So let's select that. Come down. Flow type is, again, change this to liquid because we're going to pump liquid into our simulation with this. Flow behavior, I'm going to pop this open and change it to inflow. If you leave it on geometry, the sphere itself will just turn into liquid and drop into your simulation once. I want a continuous flow of fluid, so I'm going to change this over to inflow. I'm just going to leave everything else on default. And now we're ready for our first bake. For that, reselect the fluid domain and in the physics property, in the fluid physics, right under the liquid settings, you find this option here to bake data. And that's just going to bake the fluid simulation itself. So let's hit that. That's racing through pretty quickly because we're still at pretty low settings and nothing seemed to have changed, but we're also at the start of the simulation. If you now scrub through, oh, can you see there's now fluids being emitted from this sphere. However, it just falls through our water tunnel and kind of drops to the bottom here of the domain and then kind of just vanishes over on the right-hand side. And that's not quite working how we want to. We actually want the fluid to hit this water tunnel and flow towards the shark. For that, let's select the water tunnel object. In the physics property, let's also add fluid to this object. This time, let's pop the type open and change this over to effector. And here I actually want this to be a collision object. Now, if you scrub through the rest of your simulation, when we baked this, it wasn't a collision object, so we need to rebake it. So for that, again, let's reselect the domain, come down a little bit under fluid. You can see right now this doesn't say bake because we already have baked the simulation in. We need to free it, so flush that data, and then we can rebake it. So let's press bake again. That's going to rebake the entire simulation. If you now check this out, yep, the water is definitely hitting the water tunnel. But then it's kind of like pouring through on the corners, like something isn't quite working here. And there's two things that we need to tweak to make water and collisions work a whole lot more accurately. For one, let's select the water tunnel itself. And in the physics property under fluid, for this collision here, I want to increase these sampling substeps because these fluid particles, the flip particles that are used for this generation, if they move too fast, they may penetrate your collision objects because they move too fast for the physics simulation to notice that it has passed through something it shouldn't be passing through. The sampling substeps for a collision effector essentially increase the accuracy of the collision detection. So let's jack this up to 10. Let's reselect the domain. Again, come into the fluid and free all of that. The other thing that is also contributing to the fact that the particles for the fluid simulation are penetrating through our object is that our resolution is really low. It's kind of really pixelated, so it might literally step over an object completely without even noticing. And that is controlled by this resolution divisions here, which is right now set to 32. Now, ideally, I'd pump this up to a humongous number, but because this is the resolution of the 3D space of our fluid domain, the higher you make this number, the slower the simulation will get baked. And this is quite notable. So for now, let's just double this to maybe 64. Let's bake this data again. And as you can see, this is quite a bit slower already, but it is still tolerable. So let's let that run all the way through. And that does look a whole lot better. So let's scrub back and play this forward. And that looks all right, but I can still see it pouring through here on the side. So let's reselect the water tunnel. Let's check the substeps up to 20, reselect the domain, free all of the data, and let's check this up to 80, and let's do another bake. This time I might just speed the simulation up just so you don't have to sit through this, and I will do that for other simulations going forward. So it depends on the speed of your computer as well as the detail in your simulation. And that looks pretty good. I don't see any spillage there. Let's scrub through. And that looks pretty good. However, right now, all of the water is kind of hitting the side of the domain and then just flushing underneath our water tunnel. And that is because on the domain itself, by default, all walls are solid. So everything is contained within that aquarium, and that's the default behavior. However, I'm more than happy for these particles to just vanish if they hit the side of the domain. And in order to do that, let's again come into the physics properties, come down a little bit. Let's free the data because otherwise we can't make any changes. And then you have these options here for border collisions. By default, they're all enabled, so let's disable every single one of them. So that means that if a fluid particle hits the wall of your domain, it's simply going to vanish and the liquid essentially pours out of your domain. But because we have a constant inflow of water for our shark anyway, I'm happy for those particles to flush out the side. If you let them accumulate, there's more to calculate for Blender and your simulation will keep slowing down, so I don't need to do that. What I might do though with the domain, press G and X, and let's move this over. So the domain kind of ends just at the end of that water tunnel. I don't mind if the particles kind of just vanish at that point. And again, let's rebake our simulation. Let's just zoom in a little bit and let's just play this back. So come back to 0, hit space to play. I'd say that actually looks really cool. Now, the shark itself right now has no collision, so let's fix that by selecting the shark. Let's add fluid physics to the shark as well, change the type over to effector. It's a collision by default. Because the shark has some finer detail, let's jack the sampling substeps up to 20. And I'm actually quite happy with how this fluid moves. What I might do is select the domain, free the data again. I'm going to jack the resolution up to 100, and I think that's probably as far as I go. Obviously, if you're following along, feel free to jack this up as high as you want to. Just be prepared that baking this might take a little bit. Let's just come down a little bit, and let's rebake this simulation. Let's check this out. And that's looking really nice. Can you see how the water's splashing on the face of the shark right there? I think that looks really nice. So let's come back into the physics properties for our domain. And in here, you've got tons of options for the liquid itself. Let me just free the data for now, just so we can get access to all of these properties again. In here, you have this option for liquid because we changed the domain to be liquid. This uses a simulation method called flip fluid implicit particles, which are all of these particles that you see. And I'm not going to go through all of these options, but feel free to play with some of these, like sampling, randomness. There's just a little bit too much to get into here. Now, viscosity allows you to add thickness. By default, the fluid will be very liquid, kind of like just water. If you want something more like honey or chocolate sauce, do enable viscosity. Just beware that this really slows down the simulation by like 1/10 of the speed, and make sure that the strength is really low, like 0.05 or below, closer to 0 than to 1. Otherwise, it's just a solid block of particles that won't move. Another cool option is diffusion, which allows you to add surface tension, so how much the particles within the liquid hang together, kind of just adds like a layer of tension around your liquid. Just think of jelly or something like that. I'm going to disable those two options for now. Again, play around with these. Just beware that they will make your computer work a whole lot harder. Under the Particles tab, you can generate particles for spray, foam, or bubbles, but let's just leave this collapse for now. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Now, the one thing we need for our fluid, we need a mesh, because the particles that you see in the simulation won't get rendered. They're invisible, like nothing will happen. In fact, let's come back to the top. I might actually jack the resolution up to 120 and just see how I go. Let's hit to bake our data to generate the flip fluid simulation within Mantaflow. Cool, so all of our particles are back. Let's come down. And by the way, if at this point in time you just hit F12 to render this out, well, it looks like it didn't render anything, but it actually did. It rendered a solid box where your domain is, because we haven't generated a mesh yet. So what you're actually seeing with the domain selected, come to the object properties. If you were to display this as textured, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the full domain, which is why it's fully gray, because until you generate a mesh, the domain is just a box and it will render as such. So let's switch the display as back to wire with the domain selected, come back into the physics tab, and let's generate a mesh from this fluid simulation. So let's come down here, enable the mesh option. And if you now come to bake, it'll tell you this is non-resumable. So you need to enable resumable option first. And that's why you need to enable this is resumable here. Right now I can't because I still have baked data. So let's again free our data one more time. Come to the bottom to where we switch the type of the simulation over to modular. That's still correct, but make sure you enable is resumable, because otherwise after you generated your flip simulation, you can't generate a mesh from it because the simulation isn't resumable. So once again, let's come up and let's rebake our flip simulation. Cool, all of our particles are back. And now let's come down to the mesh option. And in here, you should now be able to bake mesh. Just leave everything on default. Let's simply hit bake mesh. And again, that might take a little bit depending on the power of your computer. For me, that took about 2 or 3 minutes. And now we actually have a fluid mesh. And note that the domain itself is now the shape of that mesh. I hope they change that in future version of Blender. I'd much prefer to just have a fixed wireframe domain and a separate liquid, so I don't have to deal with this toggle back and forth. But now we actually have a mesh in our 3D scene that represents that fluid, and it moves just like the particles did. So let's rewind and just play that back. And that is looking pretty cool. And now if you hit F12, that looks much better. The domain now has the shape of the liquid mesh, and you can see the liquid flowing through right there. Let's close this for a second. And you may note that the mesh itself is actually pretty blobby and the drops are pretty big. So let's come back to the physics tab and let's free our mesh and let's play with some of these settings. The first one I want to change is the radius of these particles, and that's essentially how the flip fluid particles get converted into the mesh. The smaller you make this radius, the more fine the mesh will be, but the more likely it is also to tear. The upres factor is a multiplier on top of this resolution division, base resolution for your mesh, to essentially just add more detail into the fluids. So I'm going to jack this up to 3, but my gut's telling me that's going to take a little bit to bake. Again, I'm going to leave all of the other options on default. Have a read on what they do. They're really great in helping you control the look and feel of your fluids, but there's so much detail here. If you're keen, let me know in the comments below. I can make a more advanced tutorial and go through some of these settings here. For now, let's again simply hit Bake Mesh and then go get a coffee or feed the cat and come back once this is done. That took about 6 minutes on my machine. Let's just check that out. And yeah, can you see how there's now much more detail in that fluid? And you can just keep jacking the detail up to get even more fine-grained fluid and play with diffusion and viscosity to get just the look and feel that you want. If we hit F12 again to render this out, looks still pretty rugged. Also, it's really solid. Let's just close this out. Let's just right click on the mesh, hit Shade Smooth. Let's also come into the material tab. Let's just add a new material. Let's call this one water_matte in here. I want to change this from the principled BSDF over to the glass BSDF. I'm going to change the IOR to 1.33, which represents water. And if you hit F12, unfortunately, this won't quite work in Eevee, so if you want to render this out a little bit more realistically, be sure to come into your render settings and change the render engine from Eevee over to Cycles. I'm also going to switch my device over to GPU Compute. And if you now hit F12 to render this out, now the lighting is pretty strong, but you can see the tip of the shark's face and the fin down here. So hopefully this is enough to get you started creating, generating, and rendering fluids. The last thing I want to show you is how to add some particles for spray and foam into the simulation. Now let's just come back to the Eevee rendering engine just because it's a little bit easier to see. However, if you do want to render translucent and transparent materials like liquids, Cycles is the much better engine to use for that. Eevee is a little bit limited in that regards, at least in the current version of Blender. Now, do make sure that your domain is selected. Come back into the Physics tab, come down a little bit. And now let's pop open this Particles tab here. In here, you can determine whether to generate spray, foam, or bubble particles. For now, I'm just going to say I want to generate spray particles. Come down. And again, you have an option here to bake particles. And because we're using a modular simulation, we can free and bake each of these components individually. So let's hit Bake Particles. And again, this might take a little bit. And now you have these additional spray particles being generated wherever fluids are forcefully interacting with each other. The cool thing is you can render these particles out. The way this actually works, with the domain selected, come into the particle settings in the Properties tab, and in here you can see there's actually two particle systems on our domain. The first one is the liquid, which are the flip particles that get used to generate the mesh itself. You can actually disable them here in the viewport because, well, we've converted them into a mesh already. But then now you also have these spray particles here, which are really just these cool spray particles that are kind of splashing around. And if you rewind this and play this back, now it's getting just a little bit laggy. But you can see how all of this spray is now being generated. Now again, if you hit F12 to render this out, for one, we're in EV, so obviously fluids and translucent materials don't work too well, but none of these spray particles are actually visible. In order to make them visible, you need to modify the particle system to tell Blender that you want to render those particles. For that, let's add another object into our scene. So Shift and A, come into Mesh, and let's add another UV sphere. But before you do anything, pop open the Add UV options down here and change the number of segments to maybe 8 segments and maybe 4 rings. Because we're going to replicate the sphere for every spray particle in our scene. If there's a lot of geometry in this scene, you're literally going to kill Blender and everything's just going to grind to a halt. Let's just grab the sphere and move it up. Let's also call this one Spray Particle. Let's zoom in just a little bit and reselect our domain. So it's the mesh of the fluids. Come back into our particle system settings. Select the spray particle system here. And right now under render, it says render as halo, which is actually invisible when you render it. So let's pop this open, change this over to object. The instant object is the object I want to assign to my particles. So let's pop this open and select our spray particle. And now every particle is that sphere. Let's just scale them down maybe just a tad. I'm going to jack up the scale randomness a little bit just so they're not all quite so uniform. And if you now hit F12, you can see all of these really cool spray particles here. Yes, there's still tons of things we haven't talked about yet. Lots and lots of settings in Mantaflow that you can tweak with and play to change the look and feel of your fluids. Also how to actually render this out nicely in cycles and deal with the different material properties for different sorts of liquids. Again, leave me comments down below if you would like me to make a more advanced follow-up tutorial for this one. But hopefully this was enough to get you started with creating, modifying and rendering your own fluid simulations in Blender.
And that's all there is to it. Many thanks to Jimmy from Axe to Grind. So if you're into guitar covers, be sure to check him out. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. And because YouTube is a bit weird, be sure to check that bell icon so you actually get notified. If you want to support me, what I do on this channel, be sure to check out all of the links down in the video description. And as always, thank you very much for watching. And until next time, I will see you later.